Past Emmy champ Brian Cox is now back in the running for his role as the devious ailing media tycoon Logan Roy in Succession on HBO. I'm Charlie Bright of Gold Derby, here with Brian to ask him, what's the most dastardly thing your character did during the first season? Please dish, Brian.
There's so many, it's very hard to choose. you know, I, you know, it's a very interesting role, Logan, because people ask me these questions, and of course, I don't think in these terms. I think in as Logan needs must protect the company, protect the family, protect the firm. So in a sense, he does a series of things in order to do that, in order to present his company, himself, and his legacy. So in a way, it's very hard to say, because I think if you ask Logan Roy, he would not know what the most dastardly thing is he did, because he just does a sequence of them. And it's all about the protection of his entity. And Logan is actually in many ways quite private. He's a private man. He has a background which is slightly mysterious. We know he was born in Scotland. We know he came to Canada at a very young age. We know that he possibly went back to Scotland to work in newspapers, and that basically he's a newspaper man. And then he became this tycoon. But unlike Murdoch, he's self-made. He doesn't come from anything other than what he's created himself. And he's moved in a right direction, obviously, because he is he's sort of iconoclast, but he's an individualist, and he believes primarily in individualism. The difficulty that he has is with his children, because they've not had the life that he's had. They've had the life of entitlement, and it's very difficult to kind of sort that one out, the whole thing of entitlement in relationship to the kids. So he's constantly challenging them in order to strengthen them, in order to feel that they're, because they've got to be worthy of taking over this position. And clearly at the moment, they're not worthy. And they're constantly being challenged by the father in order to see their value and to see what they can offer to Waystar Co. And of course it's an old-fashioned fiefdom. He believes in that because he's created it. He does love his children, but he's very hard on them because of the business. So it's a kind of but it's very hard to say, oh, what is the most dastardly thing he does, because he doesn't think in those terms. He merely does what he needs. It's a needs must situation constantly. It's needs must. And that's the story of his life. He's had to make these adjustments throughout his whole life in order to create the empire that he's created. And in a way, that's very Shakespearean. It's very much like King Lear. It's very much like those characters, that we see, who have dedicated themselves to a kind of vision, of what they're doing. John Gabriel Borkman in Ibsen's plays, The Master Builder. Ibsen's a great sort of source to look at. And then from modern history, and certainly today, and that's why I really do believe this is a morality tale, because it's about the consequences of this fundamental disconnect between what your roots and what your core value is to something else. And these kids are very disconnected because of their position. And he thinks only by butting up the ass will he reconnect them again, and by giving them these challenges. And so that's what makes it very difficult. So we'll find that each season deals with one particular child at a time in order to see where the succession will lie. And it's challenging for everybody. And it's also challenging for Logan, because he does love his children, but he does he has very little patience with them.
And one of the other things that is so distinct about the show is the way that it balances the dramatic and the also very comedic aspects of everything there. And that always is, it's a very fine line it walks, but it walks it very well. Do you find yourself more drawn to the dramatic aspects of the show or the comedic aspects, or both equally?
Both equally. And you have to keep that balance. I mean, there's always a payoff, of his malcontent. He suddenly will pay off with one of those malcontent lines, which are quite withering. And it's so there's a challenge, always a challenge every time you come to it. And there's also, he is dealing with his own sense of longevity. How long has he got? What does it all add up to? What's it all? So he's on a kind of big ski run in that way, himself, dealing with his own mortality. So that feeds it up. But also the other thing from the writer's point of view is it is a document of the day about how people are living today, and the whole thing about the disconnect that the rich have from their society and how they try to run it along the way. So in that way, I think that it's quite brilliant, and it is like being in a kind of Chaucerian morality play. That you really look at it from that point of view, and therefore it presents a lot of challenges to the actor, but at the same time, it has there is a kind of classical structure to it. There's a sort of universal, this is the tale of Captain Ahab and Moby Dick. It's the sort of the iron will trying to deal with something which is undealable and unfathomable and creates all kinds of havoc. And he has this, well, certainly even in the second series, he does have this with his children, though he becomes quite protective. I won't say who, but he does become quite protective of one of his children, because he realizes that particular child has been pushed too far in one direction. And so there's a sense of reclamation has to go on. It's it's very funny. I saw Network the other day, and
I love that movie.
Yeah, it's a great movie. It's not such a great play because of the balance is wrong. The movie is wonderfully balanced. Bill Holden, Faye Dunaway, Peter Finch. There's a balance. It's a wonderful performance truly wonderful performance by Bryan Cranston. He's quite extraordinary. But the play creaks because a sort of old-fashioned 50s morality is coming into play. 60s, 50s, 60s morality. Strong morality of somebody like Chayefsky, who was quite moral. But the drama is little, now. Whereas nowadays, everything moves in parallels, and actually the algorithms are all spread out in a much more way. It's less linear. And the great thing about television, the great thing about this kind of television now, is the long form of television has kind of completely altered drama. We don't have the beginning, middle, and an end like we have in most movies or most plays. There's a middle act, there's the first act, second act, and third act. That doesn't happen in television because the second act is ongoing for as long as the show. So it's always a first act and second act, and it's endless because of what you're dealing with in terms of the personalities, in terms of the story, in terms of how the story develops, where the story can go to. And so the possibilities are also quite endless.
So you mentioned, of course, that Logan is from Scotland. You're from Scotland as well, which is part of the UK, at least for now. I don't know how that's going to age, but we'll see.
You have to watch this space.
And so the UK is where, after Australia is where Murdoch, who part of the show is based on, really came to prominence with his Empire newspaper.
Take over the Times, the Sun, the other one, the one they dropped. What was it called? I forget it. That paper that
it wasn't Daily Mail, was it?
No, not the Daily Mail. It was the other one, the News of the World, which then disappeared.
That's right.
Yeah, I mean, that's right. And it's very interesting because it's a very funny story about that. Because when I was asked to play it originally, I said, I quite like to play this as a Scot. And they said, oh, no, he has to be American. He's got to be North American of some kind. So I said, okay, fine. I've played more Americans than I've actually played British people, funny enough. So I said, okay, fine, I'll do that. So we did the first episode, and then it was said he was born in Quebec, Canada, which was what originally the pilot, because he was born in Quebec, Canada. So I thought, okay, he's a Canadian American. He's got all kinds of things influencing British, American, what have you. So they were happy. And suddenly, in the ninth episode, 1 before 10, the last one, Peter Friedman, who's wonderful, plays Frank, he comes up to me and he said, oh, Brian, they just called me in to do some ADR. I've just done some ADR. And I said, yeah. He said, yeah, they've changed your birthplace. I said, what? He said, they've changed your birthplace. I said, what do you mean they've changed it? He said, well, you're no longer born in Quebec. You're born in, he said, oh, I can't remember. And so he looked at his device and he went, oh, here we are, Dundee, Scotland. And I went, that's what I figured. That's bizarre. That is so bizarre. So I thought, this is astonishing, that they made this change. He's clearly American influenced. He's clearly spent most of his life living here, apart from perhaps when he was when he went back to Scotland as a young man, for maybe he worked. And it figures in my hometown, we have the Thomson Press, which are quite famous in Britain. And there's a paper called the Courier and Advertiser. There's also a paper called the Sunday Post, which millions of Scots read. It's one of the biggest selling papers in the world. They meet around the globe. Sorry, something's interrupting us. Oh, sorry. I have to. So it's listening. I have to listen to the British news to find out what the reality is of life. Because it's very hard living in this country and knowing what the reality is at the moment. So that was kind of interesting. So I thought, and we talked it through. And actually, one of the episodes I go to, it's a Logathon, whereas I'm going back to Dundee to play Logan Roy. I'm going to the new V&A, and he's being celebrated as one of Dundee's favorite sons. I'm also going back to Dundee because it was almost 60 years ago that I started in the theatre in Dundee, and that theatre is undergoing its 80th anniversary. So I've got to go back and present an evening with Brian Cox. So there's this kind of strange thing going on between Logan Roy and Brian Cox. It's most bizarre.
And I was wondering, actually, through having lived in the UK, being from the UK, and having seen Murdoch's influence up close, did you now getting to play this character, did you gain any sort of appreciation or sympathy for what Rupert Murdoch or his family have gone through while making this show?
What? It's again strange. I mean, that article that came out recently about the Murdochs, I don't know if you read that in the New York Times. It was a big thing in the New York Times about the Murdochs.
I read the first part of that, yeah.
Yeah. And that's exposed a lot. The fact that they had therapy, and our family has therapy, which was, and it was not known about the therapy, though our clever writer had found out about it. And clearly there's a family that are examining who they are. And I've always been obsessed with, I've been particularly obsessed in my life with Andrew Carnegie, who is a fellow Scot. And Carnegie is a very interesting character because here was a man who was incredibly poor, who did become the richest man in the world, as J.P. Morgan said to him when he sold American Steel to J.P. Morgan. He said, "You're now the richest man in the world." But he was plagued by the fact that he wanted his wealth to be a force for good. And ultimately, his wealth, when it came to the First World War, because of the steel and armaments and all that, he couldn't unstitch himself from it. And he tried to, and it wouldn't work. So the moral imperative gets put on the back burner. And, you know, as a sort of artist, I see the danger in that. I see that if you put that on the back burner, everything goes belly up, and you know, and everything turns to shit, quite frankly. And so therefore, it is also the root of great tragedy. You know, Hamlet, Macbeth, King Lear, putting everything off. You know, those inevitabilities. I mean, Lear's great line is, "I have taken too little care of this." You know, when he comes to a point where it's all gone, you know, it's all gone pear-shaped. So I think that's what's interesting about them. So in their way, I have an empathy for that, because they've set themselves on this path, and it's led them in a kind of curious cul-de-sac, terribly a familial cul-de-sac. So it must be very hard. And the one thing I did find out by sheer accident, I was in a restaurant, or in a cafe in London, and this man came up to me, and he was sort of bearded, sort of looked like an artist, terribly nice man, and he was saying how much he really enjoyed the series, and I said, "Oh, thank you." He said, "Yeah, you know, but it is difficult for my wife. She finds it really difficult." And I said, "Oh, really?" She said, "Yeah, it's hard for her. It is hard." And he said, "You know," and I said, "So who's your wife?" She said, "Elizabeth Murdoch." And I went, "Oh." And I was completely, I saw such a picture of the kind of exposure that was happening, and how it would impinge on a life, on a couple. And I felt, I was very chastened by it, because I saw, you know, that our job can be quite ruthless, what we do, but at the same time, it's also to do with sort of truth. But of course, the real truth is always much more complicated. So you knew that there was something out of that, where, you know, they found them, and they're, you know, by all accounts, they're a very happily married couple. But it was interesting to me, because I did feel responsible. I just felt, oh, but then I thought, well, that's my job. I have, you know, Shakespeare says, I have to hold the mirror up to nature. That's what I do. I present its own form. You know, I don't judge. I just present with empathy. I don't sympathize. But I have to say, there is a life that's been traced out, and you have to follow that tracing. You have to go through that and say, well, this is the life, whether you like it or not. So so I've played a lot of people who are very questionable. And sometimes I went, oh, I'm not sure about whether I should be doing this. Like I played Goering, in which I won an Emmy for. And Goering was a fascinating character, because, I mean, he was a man who was in incredible denial, but he was also rather a brilliant man. And he was also the man who created Adolf Hitler. He was a man who saw this young Viennese boy, kind of eccentric, and he threw everything behind him. And at the end of his time with Hitler, he always saw himself as a soldier. He was an airman. He was the most decorated war ace after von Richthofen. He saw himself as Hitler's, you know, he believed in the Fuhrer. And of course, he was then, at the end of the war, he was sentenced to death. And then he was sentenced to death by Hitler. And then he came, did the Nuremberg trial, and he wanted to die as a soldier. He wanted to be shot. He didn't want to be hung. He felt hanging was ignominious. So somehow or other, the night before the hanging, he committed suicide by taking poison. So you kind of, did I lose you?
No, you're good.
Oh yeah, sort of. It's the pictures come up, but so that was quite fascinating to me. Sorry, I've got MacBook Pro. I don't know what's happened here. Corey, I'm getting MacBook Pro coming up. I'm trying to talk to Sally. I've got this. The MacBook Pro has come on the screen, but I think you can hear me all right, can you?
Yes, I can hear you.
Oh, there we are. So I got it back. So I just tap that, do I? This is a brand new computer. I've never used it before. As I say, it's virginal. So, playing that, I began to understand, and what he did at the Nuremberg, because the worst thing they did for themselves was they took him off all his meds. So he had clarity, and he lost a lot of weight. He was clear, and he gave the historical argument for National Socialism, which was a legitimate argument. One doesn't agree with it, but I could see what the argument was. Where it gets into a horrible area is when you talk about the final solution and what happened in the Holocaust, and where it just went over the edge. So that, in a way, is what's quite fascinating about people like Logan Roy, is because they're ultimately human beings, but they're incredibly flawed, and it doesn't go quite right for them. It goes in a strange thing. He just wanted a business, and out of that business becomes monstrous. Well, it's very Shakespearean, actually, really.
It definitely is. Well, thanks very much, Brian Cox, and good luck at this year's Emmys. Everybody, hit the like button to subscribe to our Gold Derby channel and click on our interviews through our Emmy playlist. Thanks so much, Brian.
Thank you very much. Take care, Charles. All the best.